So welcome everybody to tonight's Our Democracy Deep Dive webinar, Ending Cash for Access. My name is Ophelia Davenport and I'm the digital organiser at the Australian Democracy Network, and I'll be facilitating tonight's session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we're calling in from tonight, we're doing so on First Nations land, and that sovereignty was never ceded, that colonisation was unjust and continues to adversely impact on First Nations people today. And I stand with Aboriginal people in their call for voice, treaty and truth. I'm here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders past and present. And I invite you to acknowledge the land that you're calling in from in the chat. So, thank you so much for joining the call tonight. What brings us together on this call is the Our Democracy campaign, which, for a little bit of a refresher, is a campaign that is working towards a political system in this country where our elected representatives reflect the values and the concerns of communities rather than big business. So, we want a system where at the heart of the decisions that our government makes is the good of people and the planet. So for those of you that don't know, the Our Democracy campaign is guided by a framework, which is up on the screen now, called a Framework for a Fair Democracy, which outlines the key reforms that are needed to achieve a fair and balanced democracy. And tonight we're going to be focusing on just one part of this framework, a very important part, which is all about ending cash for access. So in other words, the role that private money plays in distorting democracy. And I just want to frame tonight's session a little bit. The Framework for a Fair Democracy covers things as well as lobbying, transparency, the revolving door between government and industry jobs. But tonight, we will be focusing primarily just on campaign finance, which is the funding and the spending in election campaigns. We did receive a number of questions from you on some other topics, but yeah, just want to frame the context of tonight's session. So, when the last federal election happened, integrity was something that was very much on the political agenda. We had a change in government. We saw a big shift in the parliamentary makeup. We had an election of a really broad, large crossbench, and we now have a operating National Anti-Corruption Commission, which is so great to see. But there is no denying that there is still a major regulatory gap in our system that allows for unlimited amounts of money to be spent and to be donated, which results in state capture, or in other words, cash for access by harmful industries. So year in, year out, we're seeing big industries that are generally harmful. So these are industries like alcohol and fossil fuels, weapons, big tobacco, gambling. We're seeing these industries making donations to political parties. And you may have seen, next slide, please, Ash, you may have seen this photo that's been going around in the last couple of days. It's from a press call that our PM did on the weekend. So yeah, very, very timely. But industries like these expect government regulation. So they'll try to bankroll political parties to keep this regulation at bay. And once these industries then have the favour of a particular party, they'll donate big sums of money to fund that party's next election campaign, which locks us into this kind of spending arms race. So you can see how unregulated donation limits and unregulated spending limits leads to an infiltration of big money in politics and to bad policy outcomes for the community. And I just want to note that sometimes when the topic of the day is something like campaign finance legislation, it can be often hard to imagine or see how big money in politics and the impact that it has on democracy influences you and I and our daily lives and the things that we care about. So that's why tonight we've invited two excellent guest speakers, Jason Ward and Meg Webb, who are going to be sharing some examples of the way that corporate influence has impacted people's lives and the causes that they've worked on. We'll also hear a little bit about we'll hear from an Our Democracy partner, campaign partner, Alice Drury, who will speak a bit more about the problem from a policy perspective, as well as the solutions that are available. So on that note, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Jason Ward. Jason is the founder and principal analyst of the Centre for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. He has been a frequent commentator on international corporate tax issues and helps push for essential tax reforms. In his work, he's also done detailed analysis of the aged care sector in Australia and internationally to make recipients more accountable for public funding and to improve the quality by increasing transparency and accountability. So, welcome, Jason. Can you tell us a little bit about how you have witnessed the influence of private money in your work?
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. I come to you from the unceded land of the Darug people. And happy to give you an example about the aged care sector and cash for access in that sector. I'm going to give you one example, but I think it's emblematic of a much broader problem across a sector that is often cries poor, but is heavily reliant on public spending. So it's a sector dominated by private operators, some for-profit, some not-for-profit, and approximately 75% of their funding is direct federal funding. So cash for access is a significant factor in maintaining the flow of capital that they get. So I'm going to give you an example about a company called TRICARE. And TRICARE is one of the largest aged care operators in the state of Queensland. They have over 1,500 aged care beds. They operate 7 retirement villages in Queensland and 1 in New South Wales and 1 in Victoria as well. It is a large family-owned business. So in 2021, they received over $113 million in federal funding, up from $78 million in 2017. So TRICARE is owned by the O'Shea family, and in 2014, they had an estimated wealth of $342 million and were the 30th wealthiest family in the state of Queensland. And immediately following, well, not immediately, but following the 2016 federal election, two of the Shea brothers involved in the company over a 4-day period made 4 donations totaling $70,000 to the Queensland LNP. And that made them the largest political donor in the state of Queensland to anybody in that year. And since then, family members and the company have made an additional at least $15,000 in donations to the LNP. So that's quite a sizable amount of cash donated by one family business.
And Jason, do you know what TRICARE got in return for these political donations? Is there a way that we can kind of see if that cash had any access or influence?
Well, you know, as is the nature of political donations, I can't say that there was an exact, dollars for services amount, but they did get quite a lot from their political donations. So, the primary thing is that, their annual funding for federal aged care, that pipeline of dollars increased dramatically. So, it remains over 110 million per year, despite failing accreditation at a number of facilities. The family business had previously, well, the family business, it continues to be owned through Norfolk Island, which up until 2016, the same year, was a full-fledged Australian tax haven. In 2016, it was brought into the tax and transfer system under the federal government. But any company that existed in Norfolk Island before that was grandfathered in and still remains exempt from capital gains tax. So this Norfolk Island structure had been pointed out to a Senate inquiry by the Department of Health in 2009. We've generated a significant amount of attention back in the Senate and in the media on this. Nothing has happened. And in fact, the company doesn't really report profits. It transfers its money in terms of capital gains and therefore pays really little taxes on very significant revenues in Australia. So its donations have maintained that structure and protected it from that. It continues to be notified in advance of any inspections. So there's allegations that it gets a warning about when inspectors come to their facilities. And it continues to benefit from state government contracts. It runs a business called NutriFresh, which supplies catering to all of its aged care and retirement village businesses. But it has state contracts to provide meals for Meals on Wheels that are delivered to people's homes, and has contracts to provide food for public hospitals as well. So yeah, despite its failing accreditation, despite crying poor and staff cuts to run facilities in dangerous ways with low levels of staffing, it continues to be rewarded with huge amounts of business. The latest trick of this company has been to restructure its employing business, the operating business, as a nonprofit entity, so that it can then, the nonprofit entity can be somewhat out of scrutiny as well, and also paying rent to the for-profit entity in Norfolk Island, so continuing to avoid taxes and potentially avoiding obligations to its workers as well. So this is, we've had some positive aged care reforms under the new government. It was an election commitment, but it's a system that suffers from regulatory capture. And there's a long way to go to continuing to make improvements and increase transparency and accountability in this particular sector.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, sounds quite lucrative, to be honest, despite the narrative that they might push. And I think when you mentioned you were going to speak about this example, I was reading about TRICARE and how they used to be based in Norfolk Island, and that I don't think a single member of the O'Shea family had stepped foot on Norfolk Island. So I thought that was quite interesting.
It receives more in federal government every year than the GDP of Norfolk Island as a whole. So more federal money comes to it than the GDP of the island. It has more employees than the residents of Norfolk Island.
Wow, there you go. Goodness me. Yeah, thank you, Jason, for sharing that case study. I think it's great to hear an example like this, because often when we talk about political donations, I know that I refer to harmful industries quite a lot, and my mind often just goes to that place of thinking of, the dirty fossil fuel industry or big tobacco, and the aged care sector isn't necessarily something that immediately comes to mind for me. And I think it's a great example to remind us that anybody can really exploit this regulatory gap in the system, and that ultimately this is a systemic problem. So thank you for sharing your insights about that sector. Now I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Meg Webb. Meg is the independent member for Nelson in Tasmania. She was elected to the Tasmanian Legislative Council in 2019 after 2 decades working in the community sector. Having started in service delivery and then management roles, Meg moved into areas of social policy, research and advocacy with organisations such as Volunteering Tasmania, the Tasmanian Council of Social Service and Anglicare's Social Action and Research Centre. Integrity and transparency in government is an area of particular priority in Meg's work. And tonight, Meg is going to share a story about how she's witnessed the influence of the gambling industry using their financial powers to have political sway. So over to you, Meg.
Thanks so much, Ophelia. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of the event, and I pay my respects to the Muanina people. This is the land that I'm on, is the Muanina people, who unfortunately did not survive invasion and dispossession of this land. So I also pay my respects more broadly to the Pakana people of Tasmania, the Palawa Pakana Tasmanian Aboriginal community, whose connection to this land was never ceded and whose culture endures despite the attempted genocide in this state of its First Nations people. And just to the point to pick up on from earlier, I love that picture you put up with Albanese in his Rio Tinto shirt, which I think was just an appalling example of influence of industry, and one that put me in mind of Robin Williams, the wonderful comic Robin Williams, who's now passed away, but he once quoted that politicians should wear sponsor jackets like NASCAR drivers, and then we'd know who owns them, which I think is really pertinent to that and came to mind straight away when I saw that Rio Tinto shirt. But I've got a short time and I'm going to tell you a story about the 2018 state election in Tasmania, which is widely regarded as being bought by the poker machine industry. Now, I'm going to skip through a bit of background. I'm going to talk about then what happened in that campaign during that state election. And then I'm going to just point to what I think are sort of three key factors that are really important to pull out of that experience and what happened here. And then hopefully have some questions to answer from Ophelia. So we'll see how far I can get. Many of you may be aware of the poker machine industry, the gambling industry broadly, but the poker machine part of that industry is incredibly powerful and influential, and it throws its influence around in the political space significantly. To talk about state capture, policy capture, regulatory capture, that industry, the poker machine industry it's embedded in it as part of it. Western Australia is the only state who would be relatively free from influence in that space, because they were smart enough to never put poker machines out into their community to keep them only in their casino environments. So that constrained the influence to some extent. But as an industry and as a broad general statement, I would say that it's an industry that has always basically written its own rules, and every state government and federal government has just like bent over and taken that and taken on board industry requested regulation for itself. We saw that in Tasmania, certainly. When poker machines were first put out into the community in the 90s here, a single license was given to one big industry player, and then that industry player has dictated ever since the terms on which that license gets renewed each time. It normally, it's that entity is called Federal Group. So they have attempted, every time the license has come up for renewal, they've attempted to preempt that through political influence behind the scenes to reinstate more favourable conditions each time, and have largely been successful each time. So that was sort of the background to the coming up to the 2018 election. We had an election due in 2018. We also had the poker machine licence owned by Federal Group due to expire that year, and the conditions of the next iteration were to be determined and decided. So that's a very clear confluence of an important political decision and an election that could be influenced in relation to that decision if necessary. What was particularly interesting is that in the few years leading up to that, there became a public conversation about poker machine licensing and regulation and the opportunity that the end of the licence period presented in 2018. It was sparked partly by, I don't know if any of you are aware of a very quirky fellow down here called David Walsh, who owns Mona, our Museum of Old and New Art, this massive private gallery, and who's interestingly made his money from gambling, but not poker machines. And he's very anti-poker machines. And he sort of brought into the public eye this discussion about poker machines back in about 2015, because he wanted a license for a casino, and that would have triggered a renewal and a renegotiation of the pokies license behind closed doors. So he pulled out and refused to do that and said, no, I'm not going to trigger that, because pokies, and please excuse the expression that he used, but he said pokies are granny raping machines, and he wouldn't have anything to do with promoting them. So we had an active community conversation. We even had a parliamentary inquiry in 2016-17 where lots of discussion was happening about what would happen next after 2018 with pokies licences. We got to late 2017 and it was time for the two major parties to put their cards on the table and present what they would take to the election as their position on this. And we had, on the one hand, during the parliamentary inquiry that had just finished up in late 2017, we had a model for what should happen next that the industry had literally written themselves. So Federal Group and the THA, the Tasmanian Hospitality Association, they'd created a model of what they thought should happen next for the next licensing period. Thank you. And the Liberal Party picked that model up and said, that's what we're going to do after the election if we're elected. And the Labor Party, amazingly, came out and said, we're going to do what we think is evidence-based and responsible. We're going to take pokies out of pubs and clubs. Bam, right there, you've got immediate an election fought on an issue where there's a clear difference, one pro-industry and one not anti-industry, but certainly consequences for the industry. My goodness, then did that spark a fight? We saw massive impact into the campaign straight away. Two things happened in terms of support for the industry. One is that industry money flowed to the Liberal Party, and we saw in Tasmania a sea of blue across our state. We saw a party able to conduct a campaign to a degree beyond anything we'd seen before. But alongside what was donated to the Liberal Party directly, we also saw a campaign from a third party. It was a group called Love Your Local, which was funded from the Hospitality Association locally, but also with money from the mainland down into Tassie. And that was huge, flooding campaign through our TV stations, our radio stations, billboards, all around the state, and importantly, on every pub with pokies, massive banners, massive canvas banners. And they said things, let me just find where I've written it down. They said things on these banners, really overt things like, Labor and the Greens think you're stupid. What's next? Don't let them tell you what to do. They said things like, save our jobs, vote Liberal. All the people working in these pubs had to wear T-shirts saying, save my job, ask me how. They had just this flooding third-party campaign. In Tasmania, we don't have campaign donation disclosure laws at all. We default to the Commonwealth laws, which we know are entirely inadequate. The upshot is we never knew what happened, what the extent of what happened with the donations, both to the Liberal Party itself for the campaign, but even more massively into this third-party Love Your Local campaign. Flooded the state. I was campaigning in my work in Anglicare on the other side of the equation. All kinds of constraints, as many of you would be aware if you're NGOs. We couldn't come out and say, vote for them or don't vote for them, because NGOs can't do that when you're receiving funding from the government. We had to campaign on the issue, but we couldn't campaign politically in the campaign environment. Very difficult, very tiny amount of money that we had to spend compared to what was millions and millions into those other pro-Liberal and pro-industry campaigns. David Walsh, the owner of Mona, who had actually sort of triggered this off to some extent, he funded a third-party campaign actually sort of for reform, for the positive reform of taking them out of pubs and clubs. But again, compared to the Love Your Local campaign, it was tiny. So it was a really David and Goliath battle. It looked really uneven. Amazingly, it was a fairly close result given that. But the other thing that the third-party campaign did, when they knew that their pro-industry messages had sort of reached the extent of influence that they were going to reach, they also pivoted to supporting the other campaign messages that the Liberal Party were running. So the Liberal Party were running very strong messages about you need a majority government, vote Liberal for a majority stable government. So the Love Your Local campaign also echoed those campaign sentiments. So they played into that side of it as well to offset the fact that some people would have been finding their pro-industry messages quite unpalatable. Right, so the things I think were at play there that are just important that I'll draw your attention to. One is that we'll never have visibility and accountability around the spending that occurred there and the influence that was brought to bear, because we just didn't have the rules in place. And we still don't, interestingly, which I think we'll come to talk about in a minute. We also have absolutely no caps then also on electoral spending by parties or by third-party campaigners, and that's important. It immediately means there's an entirely unlevel playing field if you've got money flowing massively in one direction. And there were different constraints on the actors of both sides of that campaign. So whereas the industry could come out overtly and say, vote Liberal, don't vote Labor, advocates on the other side of the campaign, like I was, were incredibly constrained about how we could frame the messages that we were putting into the space for consideration. And alongside that, you'd have lots of people in the community sector who wanted to be able to campaign and publicly say things, and yet they would feel constrained because they would also say, oh, but we receive donations from Federal Group. And if we don't get the $2,000 they give us each year for our volunteers' Christmas party, we won't be able to have our Christmas party, and things like that we heard all the time. So the industry had also suppressed opposing voices by its largesse, which is cheap for that industry, to throw around donations everywhere in the community, but it buys them silence from people opposing them too. That seems like quite a random and kind of download of all those things at you, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what that campaign period was like. The sheer volume of money that was clearly flowing in to the two sides of the campaign, the Liberal Party campaign and Third Party campaign, was just something that's astonishing that we've never seen before, and I doubt we'll probably see again here.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. It's just such an unbelievable example that happened, and it's just industry influence to a T. I'm curious, did you feel that there was much outrage from the community in Tasmania after this happened, after the 2018 election result?
There was a sense of dirtiness, actually, in the community. Everybody knew that was grubby, that result, the way the result came about was grubby and wrong. I think there was a sense of outrage amongst some in the community who were really engaged with it. There was also a sense of absolute devastation and demoralisation from so many of us who had been campaigning, really trying to win that David and Goliath battle. And I think it's interesting because I think the Liberal government that was then formed after winning that election, the Premier at the time then was Will Hodgman, and I think they knew how grubby it was. And the election was in March. In May that year of 2018, the Premier Hodgman came out and promised to bring in campaign donation disclosure laws for the first time in our state. The promise was made in May 2018. We're here in, August 2023. Those laws have yet to complete passing our Parliament. We may well be dealing with them next week in the upper house where I sit, but we're still 5 years down the track. So I think there was sort of that acknowledgement, but then dragging feet to actually see it come about.
Yeah, right. And you mentioned there was that sense of dirtiness. Is that something that even now amongst your parliamentary colleagues, obviously at this time when you were doing advocacy for this, it was before you were elected to the Legislative Council, do people generally consider it a bought election, or even on the other side of government, or is it just considered politics?
No, I think it is seen. It is seen as a tainted election, and even I think those who are sort of on the Liberal side who won the election don't speak of it because they know that it's a tainted result and that it doesn't look good to them. So they don't speak it, but others freely speak about it. Independents like me, people from the Labor or Greens parties, people in the community regard it as grubby and tainted. I think the interesting thing, though, is it worked. So what happened was, although the Premier, not long afterwards, came out and promised to bring in campaign donation reform laws, a similar time afterwards, the Labor Party in Tasmania came out and backflipped on their position and basically said they'd never go to an election again, promising that kind of policy of taking pokies out of pubs and clubs. In fact, the next election that came around in 2021, it came to light during the campaign of that election that the Labor Party had a secret MOU with the Tasmanian Hospitality Association, which basically, among many other points, said that they would give the THA veto over any harm minimisation measures they would consider. So just before the 2018 election, I went to a fascinating little talk by Anthony Green from the ABC, and he was reflecting on what was clearly happening in this election context of the money flooding in. And he made the point that little talk, and I don't want to verbal him. So, but what I heard him describe is that when you see this sort of money thrown around, it isn't just about the result of this election that is trying to be influenced. They were trying to make sure that no party ever again in any future election would take such an anti-industry policy to an election. This was a case, a demonstration of do not cross us. This is what happens if you cross us. We will come down on you like a ton of bricks. So, and that observation is right. You know, I think that lesson was learnt in this state by both parties, the winner and the loser of the election. And I think that's really tragic, because it isn't just about one election result. It's about making sure everyone stays in line from here on in.
Yeah, that is very tragic. And I'm interested to know, has anything changed in the way of regulation against pokies since then?
It's fascinating, actually. It's a fascinating situation, because the Liberal Party, as they had promised and as the industry had purchased with that election, they brought in a new regime that was the exact model that the industry had designed and put on the table just before the election. And they brought that through in legislation in 2021, and many of us fought really hard. Certainly I was in Parliament by then, and I fought very hard against it in the upper house, and it was a very protracted debate because of that. But that legislation got through, and it didn't have any harm minimisation. It had a very favourable model. However, fascinatingly, after that had gotten through and they delivered on what the industry had purchased at the election, the Treasurer came out, or the fellow who ended up being the Treasurer at that time, came out just last year and announced that they would be putting in a reform in Tasmania of a card-based pokies use that will be nation leading. It will have spending limits on it, and it will be the most significant harm minimisation measure ever introduced in this country when it comes to poker machines. Out of the blue, surprise to everyone, total, utter surprise. And he's done it in a way where he'll never have to fight the industry on it, most likely, because it doesn't have to be taken to an election. It doesn't have to be legislated through the Parliament. It can be done under his direction. And the industry will have no points of influence in which to change that decision, unless he were to lose his job and a new Treasurer came in and flipped it before it was in place. But how fascinating is that? It was almost like, I think potentially personally, it was a commitment from him. He wanted to do that. He knew he had to see out what they'd promised with the new model and the legislation for that. And then he found his time and his mechanism to make a real lasting difference, potentially in a way that we've never seen before. So it's yet to happen. It's supposed to be implemented next year. It's currently being designed and planned. We'll see. I'm never going to count my chickens till they've hatched. But by this time next year, or certainly by the end of next year, Tasmania could be the best placed state in the country, bar Western Australia, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of harm minimisation. Unbelievable. That would be incredible.
Yeah, amazing.
Again, only possible when you can avoid any moments and mechanisms by which the industry might be able to bring its influence to bear.
Yeah, that's right. So many complexities there. And yeah, fingers crossed that your many years of advocacy in this space finally pays off at some point. Meg, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us tonight. It's such a compelling example of corporate influence. And yeah, just really great to see people like you that have been part of, you know, this fight against corrupting money to be in positions of leadership and be standing up for the interests of the community. So yeah, thank you for speaking tonight.
So, Ophelia, thanks for having me. And it certainly prompted me to run for Parliament the next year in 2019. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Meg. Alrighty, so now I'm going to pass to Alice Drury, who is a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre and has been working on the Our Democracy campaign for many years. Alice is going to talk to us a little bit more about the problems and solutions of cash for access from a policy perspective. Over to you, Alice.
Great. Thanks so much, Ophelia. And yeah, what a great case study to be speaking on the back of. Absolutely shocking what the gambling industry did in Tasmania to make an example for the rest of the country to say, do not follow Western Australia's suit and ban pokies outside of casinos. So I was reading just the other day, actually, that a study by the Australia Institute showed that 76% of the world's pokies outside of casinos are in Australia, and we're the most addicted country in the planet by quite a way. I'll touch on the settings at federal level, so the laws at federal level that make this kind of influence possible. And I suppose the bottom line is that federal level, there is no limit on how much companies or individuals can donate to political parties. And there's also no limit to how much they can spend. So in the lead up to the last election, Labor received about $50 million in private wealth, and the coalition roughly $60 million. That was up about 18 to 20% from the 2019 election. So private money is on the rise, and we know that it has a corrupting influence on our democracy. Single companies and wealthy individuals are giving millions, and the reason why they're giving millions is because it buys them influence. So I've got a couple of, don't know where the slides have gone, but that's all right. I can happily speak without them. I think we might be a couple of slides in. Yep. Beauty. So next slide. There we go. So we've got Malcolm Turnbull, needs no introduction, saying himself, by and large, when industries give money to political parties, they are seeking to influence them. We've had the treasurer of the Liberal Party come out and say that he wants law reform in this area because it's so corrupt. And to be clear, he was the head honcho of bringing in political donations to the Liberal Party for about 45 years. A Labor equivalent from New South Wales has come out and said the same thing. And it's absolutely what the data shows us. So over the last 20 years, the fossil fuels industry has donated about $25 million to the major parties. If we add Palmer's donation to himself, to the United Australia Party, over the last couple of elections, the fossil fuel contributions skyrocket to about $232 million. Gambling, $62 million over 20 years to the major parties. Property developers, $54 million. Gives you a bit of a vibe in terms of where all of that election spending is coming from. Another thing that I wanted to touch on is peak organisations and the roles that they play. So Meg really helpfully talked about one of them, the Australian Hotels Association. Please remember their name. They're really crucial. They are all of the evil gambling companies under a different name, that all of the industries do that, so that you don't go out there and say, hang on a second, why is Tabcorp telling me that I should be voting Liberal? That seems really sus. They won't do it under Tabcorp. They'll do it under Australian Hotels Association. When it comes to the fossil fuel companies, they'll do it under the Minerals Council of Australia or APPIA. So they've all got these, they're kind of like astroturfing type organisations often. So they themselves also make large political donations, and they also spend big. I'll get to that in a second. But I also just wanted to touch on some examples of how political donations rise in peak periods when there are really important public debates happening around how to regulate the industry. So the donations to the coalition increased roughly tenfold in 2010, coinciding with the mining tax debate. They spiked again in 2014 when Labor had announced a tax on carbon. Price on carbon, I should say. Similarly, we saw the same thing happen with the gambling industry when $1 pokey bets, $1 limits on pokies were introduced. So we know that donations coincide with policy outcomes, and they're deliberately used to give to whichever party doesn't support tough regulation. And they spend big, and I'll get to spending in a second, to punish whichever party comes out in support of public interest reform. I think I'll move on to spending, actually. So like there's no limits on political donations, there's no limits on election spending. The problem with this is it keeps the major parties locked in an arms race. So we'll just move on to the next slide, if that's all right. Perfect, thank you. So federal candidates can spend as much as they like in their attempts to win our votes, and keeps them in a perpetual arms race. This unchecked spending means that each election is generally more expensive than the last, and it's increased by 144% in the last 2 decades. Some analysis by Nielsen shows an even more troubling picture, which is that TV and radio spending was up 70% in 2022 from the 2019 election, and 2019 was already a very expensive election. What this does is it creates bigger and bigger pressure on all candidates to fundraise each election. And in the next slide, we've just got to, oh no, that's all right. Yeah, there we go. So as the pressure builds to raise more than your opponents, your dependency on donations and on donors increases, and what you're willing to trade for those donations also increases, right? So that's the major issue that we have with not having spending caps, as well as the problem that Meg was just speaking to in terms of gambling, like leaving our elections exposed to industries coming in and spending huge amounts trying to win our votes outright. Transparency alone is absolutely not enough. We need caps on donations and on election spending. We all know how much Clive Palmer spent in 2019, $84 million. Didn't stop him from spending $116 million in the 2022 election. So transparency alone is definitely not enough, although it's greatly needed. And it's also crunch time. It's a crucial moment right now to achieve these reforms. So Labor has committed to elections and spending caps, as well as greater transparency, through this committee called the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. We know that they're negotiating with various parties to try and make that happen. Now's the moment to create the pressure to make sure they make good on their promise. However, there is we need to proceed with a degree of caution, because there are ways of introducing caps that are good, and there are ways of introducing caps that are very, very bad. And I'll touch on that for in a second. But first, I just wanted to outline out loud the 3 reforms that the Our Democracy campaign is pursuing. So these are our 3 principles, sorry. So first, reforms should reduce corporate influence on our democracy, what we've been talking about tonight. Second, reforms should protect the ability of civil society and community voices to be active in public debates around elections. And third, reforms should keep Parliament open to new entrants and ensure people have meaningful choice at the ballot box. So I'll explain a little bit about principles 2 and 3 as well. So the difficulty with donation and spending caps is that the net can be cast too widely, and it can end up restricting the income to public interest charities like Anglicare that we were just talking about before, because they receive donations. So you can restrict the amount of money coming into charities, but those big peak organisations, the industry peak organisations like the Australian Hotels Association or Minerals Council of Australia that I was just talking about, they don't rely on donations. So if you only cap donations, you can end up basically totally silencing charities that are advocating for good reform and doing nothing to regulate really harmful industries in buying our votes. So that's one thing that we have to be really diligent and watch out for. The third principle is also really important, which is that we have learned over the last couple of elections and also in state jurisdictions that if donation caps and spending caps aren't set with the right mechanisms, what they can actually do is make life much, much harder for new entrants and for independents to challenge incumbents, people sitting in Parliament, from the major parties. And that's what's effectively happened in New South Wales and Victoria. The settings were not right. It was effectively it was a stitch up by the major parties. They've ensured that they can keep getting public funding, whereas new entrants and independents won't receive that public funding, and they are stuck. They're unable to get their voice out there. They're unable to raise enough money, spend enough money to get the name recognition that they need to get the votes. So there's a little bit of a tightrope to walk here, but we have the policy settings. We're sort of ready to go to push Labor to do the right thing and make sure that we've got the laws in place to reduce corporate influence.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice, for running us through that. We now have some time for Alice to answer some of the questions that you submitted when registering for this event. There were really a lot of great questions, and we've just picked out a few that we think are especially relevant tonight. The first question is from Andrew Davidson, who I'll invite now to come off mute and ask his question. If you're there, Andrew.
Yep, I'm here. First of all, Alice, thanks very much indeed for that resume. I suppose I'm shocked, surprised, horrified that we've ended up with the sort of system we have, where there's so much opportunity for a conflict of interest into our political system. My question is a little more basic than, modifying what we've got. What I was wondering is why can we not get rid of all donations and make elections funded entirely by the taxpayer? The cost that's going to be incurred by the taxpayer is going to be a whole lot less than the kickbacks that currently go from politicians to industry.
Thanks, Andrew. It's such a great question. So it's worth outlining that currently politicians do receive a fair amount of public money. So you receive about $2.87 per primary vote. So every person who put number one next to your name in the lower house electorate, you get to $2.87 per person. Why don't we get rid of private donations entirely and just make it that system? We actually face a constitutional issue with that. So the High Court has come out and said that you can't ban donations altogether, because donations are an important way in which people express their democratic support for a political party or a candidate. So I think we would actually face constitutional issues if we sought to ban political donations entirely. That being said, it is perfectly constitutional to limit them so that it's a much lower amount. So people can still show support by giving a donation to Party X, but they shouldn't be able to give $50,000 to show support for Party X.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks, Andrew, for your question. The next question is from Craig Blakey, who I'll invite to come off mute now.
Oh, thanks, Ophelia. I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, look, I've only basically just got the one question there for Alice. It's got two parts to it. It would appear obvious as to why businesses may donate to political parties and or candidates, especially if they are in industries that are subjected to government regulation. Firstly, why do businesses and corporations make these donations and candidates give for accepting them?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Another great question. So the reason almost exclusively that big political donors give, like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Woodside, Minerals Council, they've all said that they actually give out of altruistic reasons in order to support democracy. So that's the usual line that you'll hear from corporates. The reason why they actually give and things that they tend to say off the record or when they slip up, like the Minerals Council did last year, they say, well, it buys us access. And in fact, Ernst & Young, when they were pushed on this in a committee hearing earlier this year, you're also going to follow the lead of PricewaterhouseCoopers and say, we're not going to give political donations anymore. Ernst & Young said, no, because we don't want to give up the access that gives us to politicians. So it definitely buys you access. It certainly buys you influence. And there was actually Kypros Kypri is a health researcher, and he had this great quote from a political insider, from a politician, who said, if they give you $10,000, they've bought influence. But if they give you $100,000, they've bought you. So that's why they give.
Thanks, Alice. And finally, we have a question from Daniel Boerma.
Thanks, Ophelia. Yeah, so my question is, are there other democracies throughout the world that have legislation that restrict cash for access? How long have these laws been in effect? And what impact have they had on the democratic process? Another
great question. So most liberal democracies have much stricter laws than Australia does. In fact, also the federal system lags behind all other states. Well, we'll do shortly once Tasmania passes its better transparency laws. But I think the short answer is, if we look at comparative jurisdictions, Canada, New Zealand, UK, they all have caps on spending at the very least. New Zealand doesn't cap donations, but Canada, US, and the UK all do. And it's hard to trace a direct, and therefore there was less influence. But the reality is that there's definitely been less corruption as a result of the end of this kind of quid pro quo ability to give donations and receive regulatory benefit in return.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alice, for answering that one. We have had a little bit of activity in the chat, and one theme that seems to be coming up is a question around why we can't just ban donations from organisations and keep them available for individuals only. Is there a clear answer to that question, Alice?
There's a murky clear answer. One of the issues that we have is that actually a lot of wealthy individuals give. So you've got Anthony Pratt, who owns Visi, who is one of the richest people in Australia. He gives well over $1 million, generally speaking, to the coalition. So if you just had a ban on corporations and unions from giving, then it wouldn't capture folks like that. But the other problem is there is also, it was a bit of a throwaway line by the High Court that did make reference again to it being important that businesses, corporations, unions can donate under the Constitution. How much stock, it wasn't actually the issue that the High Court was deciding on in that moment. How much stock to put in it is a little bit uncertain, but that is kind of hanging over our heads and somewhat stopping us from saying that it should just be limited to people registered on the electoral roll.
Great. Well, thank you, Alice, for answering those questions, and thank you to Andrew, Craig, and Daniel for asking them. And sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions tonight. So, as Alice noted, this is a really opportune time to put pressure on decision makers, and we really need to be using the next few months to be active in the system that governs us by letting our MPs know that we expect a system that is fair and is balanced. So to wrap up tonight's session, I'd like to share some ways that you can take action within this space if you wish to. We're expecting the final recommendations from the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters to be released in around late October. And we know that the ALP are working on their policy details right now for this. So we're asking supporters of this campaign to try and meet their MP in September and October. We're suggesting that the most strategic thing our community can do right now is to meet with their Labor MP or their Labor Senator and ask them to make sure that the three principles that Alice spoke to earlier are at the heart of any campaign finance legislation that they develop. If this is something that you're interested in doing, tomorrow we're going to send around a follow-up email. And if you want to meet with your MP, we ask that you reply to that email to let us know, and then we can send you some useful supporting resources and some extra campaign material. And we can also help connect you with others in your electorate that are also interested in meeting their MP. For example, we already have folks in the electorates of Shortland and Ballarat who are seeking to be connected with someone to meet their MP with them. So it just makes it a much nicer experience to go with somebody else if you can. We'll also be sharing a link to our Ending Cash for Access petition, which Ash, I think, is going to paste in the chat now as well. We'll share it in our email tomorrow, and it would be fantastic if you could sign that and share it around. So that brings us to the end of tonight's webinar. I want to thank all of our speakers once again, Jason and Meg, for sharing your fantastic examples of where you have witnessed big money in action throughout the course of your careers. And thank you to Alice for taking us through the big problems and solutions available from a policy perspective and reminding us of the key principles in which we should be thinking about reform. Of course, thank you to all of you for being here tonight, for being so engaged, for your juicy questions. And I really hope that together we can show our strength in numbers, we can show our representatives that we expect a democracy that is fair and that is balanced and that is free from the clutches of big business. So on that note, thank you everybody and have a great rest of your night.